Good evening. My name is Monica Galizzi, and I live in Lexington, and I'm delighted to introduce our third lecture of our season 2020-2021. I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Lexington Public Library and the Cary Lecture Series Committee, Bob Halperin, Rita Goldberg, Maggie Pax, Kevin Ory, and myself. We are indebted to the Cary sisters, Suzanne and Eliza, who exactly 100 years ago set up the Cary Fund in memory of her father. Their goal was to sponsor his free public lectures on educational subjects to benefit the community. This evening is recorded by LexMedia, and we thank them. We also want to thank the Colonial Times that helped us advertise this event. Our speaker will talk for around 25 minutes, but then he really wants to have an opportunity to engage in question and answers with you. And this will be moderated by Maggie Pax. Please enter any question you have by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Also, if you're encountering any technical difficulty, use the chat button so we can assist you. And also on the chat, through the chat, you will see instruction about how to silence the small captions if they bother you during the lectures. As we start, we want to acknowledge that some people who in Lexington had planned to be with us tonight are not here because they are attending a community gathering and vigil to support our Asian and Asian American friends, families, and neighbors following the Atlanta hate crimes. We want to ask you to join us in a moment of silence in memory of Atlanta victims. Thank you. This evening, our guest is Professor Chad Williams. He's the Samuel and Augusta Spector Professor of History and African American Studies at Brandeis University. Professor Williams received his PhD in history from Princeton University and specializes in African American and modern United States history. Every year when our committee decides whom to invite to our lectures, we try to look for topics and speakers who can address issues of interest to our community. More than a year ago, when I started conducting Professor Williams, I did so because I thought about the work our town had done a few years ago to try to rediscover the Lexington history and experiences during World War I. I knew Professor Williams for his scholarly work on World War I. And this is a time that I'm personally very interested about because I often still read the letters that my Italian grandfather wrote when he was on the Austrian front in 1915. But I was particularly intrigued by the opportunity of hearing from Professor Williams about the experience of Black soldiers. The topic of Professor Williams' book, which is titled Torchbearers of Democracy, African American Soldier in the World War I era. As many people in Lexington, I was not born in the United States, I did not grow up in the United States, and I did not go to school in the United States. Therefore, I always felt that I knew very little about Black history. I felt that this was an incredibly difficult and painful chapter in the history of his country, but a chapter somehow remote from me at the time when I chose to come to this country and make it my new home. But the event of last year, George Floyd's murder, and the disproportionate price paid by the Black community in the United States during COVID-19 has shown me, as well as everybody who was born or not born in this country, that in the US, racism and the challenges of the Black community are not only something from the past, but are very much part of our own story now. We are extremely grateful to Professor Williams, who has decided to guide us tonight through a reflection about the origin and the development of the Black Lives Movement. His co-edited book, titled The Charleston Syllabus, Reading on Race, Racism, and Racial Violence, was published 5 years ago, but has quickly become a fundamental reading for people who want to understand what is happening right now in the United States. Please join me in welcoming Professor Williams tonight.
Thank you very much, Monica, for that kind and incredibly gracious introduction. It is my great privilege and honor to be here with all of you this evening, to be a part of this distinguished lecture series. I'm going to share my screen and hope that we don't run into any technical issues on that front. Again, I'm very grateful for everyone to be here this evening, to take the time out of your Saturday evenings, which I know are very precious. So I want to jump right into it and hopefully leave as much time for question and conversation at the end of my talk, because I believe that that's really one of the most important things that we can get out of this conversation this evening. So as Monica said, my initial thinking in agreeing to deliver this talk was to connect it to my work related to World War I and the experiences of African American soldiers in particular. But as we know, things change. At this time, 1 year ago, I was teaching a course at Brandeis in the spring semester on the Black Lives Matter movement. All was going well, relatively smoothly, until March 11th, when life abruptly changed. We adjusted to the realities of a suddenly remote course, but it certainly wasn't the same. It was an incredibly difficult time for all of us, for myself, but especially for my students. Compounding our challenges, the final weeks of the semester were marked by the horrific deaths of several Black people at the hands of the police and white vigilantes. As we held virtual graduation ceremonies, protests began to sweep the nation, and the Black Lives Matter movement had recaptured the country's and the world's attention. So the timing of my talk has not escaped me as I was gathering my thoughts for this evening. As a historian attempting to make sense of events from not even a year ago, in some ways is almost sacrilegious. However, there is no denying the fact that what we witnessed and lived through in the summer of 2020 was indeed a historically unprecedented event. As such, I believe it demands our attention. So this is my attempt to offer what I describe as an early history of the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020. It is at once speculative, while also grounded in both history and a critical analysis of contemporary political phenomena. It is my attempt to make sure that 1 year later, we do not forget what took place, why it took place, and what it continues to mean today. So what I'd like to do over the next few minutes is to provide some background about the Black Lives Matter movement, revisit the events of this past summer, offer some thoughts on what happened and what was different, and then open up a discussion of where we go from here. So let's, as I said, let's get into it. When it comes to the history of Black people and Black movements in the United States, I think it's fair to say that this country suffers from an acute case of amnesia, as well as distortion and maybe even willful erasure. So for that reason, it's important to emphasize that the Black Lives Matter movement did not start this past summer. It did not begin in the summer of 2020. Indeed, we can actually trace the long historical roots of the Black Lives Matter movement, certainly back as far as the early 19th century, continuing through the 19th century into the early 20th century in the context of a long Black freedom struggle, long civil rights movement. But that would probably be a completely different talk. So for our immediate purposes, it's important to acknowledge the origins of the Black Lives Matter movement, specifically in 2013, and the individuals who sparked it. It began with a Facebook post, a relatively innocuous Facebook post by Alicia Garza on July 13th, 2013, following the acquittal of George Zimmerman, who was on trial for killing Trayvon Martin. And this is Alicia Garza's tweet, Facebook post. We'll get to Twitter a little bit later. She, along with Opal Tometi and Patrisse Cullors, announced that they were starting a new movement using the hashtag Black Lives Matter. In her post, Patrisse Cullors wrote, Alicia Garza, myself, and hopefully more Black people than we can imagine are embarking on a project. We are calling it Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is a movement attempting to visualize what it means to be Black in this country, provide hope and inspiration for collective action, to build collective power, to achieve collective transformation, rooted in grief and rage, but pointed towards vision and dreams. Who Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors are is critically important to keep in mind. Garza, Tometi, and Cullors had deep experience in various grassroots activist organizations. As three queer Black women, they applied an intersectional approach to the mattering of Black lives. They also emphasized a decentralized organizing strategy that moved away from top-down leadership structures and allowed for coalition building. This reflected their knowledge of past Black protest movements and organizations such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the 1960s and the Combahee River Collective in the 1970s. The Black Lives Matter movement gained increased attention in the wake of the August 9th, 2014 death of Michael Brown, a Black teenager who was shot and killed by a white policeman in Ferguson, Missouri. The subsequent protests and the militarized response captured the intention of the nation and indeed the world. Very quickly, what began as a local movement in Ferguson, Missouri, quickly erupted into a much broader national phenomenon. So we continue into December of 2014, when on December the 3rd, a Staten Island grand jury decided not to indict a white police officer in the death of a Black man, 43-year-old husband and father of 6, Eric Gardner, who was killed on July 17th, Staten Island, New York, and whose death had been officially ruled a homicide. Again, protests swelled the streets of cities from coast to coast. Throughout December, tens of thousands of people across the country participated in acts of nonviolent civil disobedience. The Black Lives Matter movement continued to grow. The subsequent months seemed to come with a never-ending stream of more Black deaths. There was Azeel Ford, Kai Gurley, Tanisha Anderson, John Crawford, Tamir Rice. There was the death of Sandra Bland, 28-year-old Black woman who was found dead in a jail cell in Waller County, Texas on July 13th, 2015, 3 days after being arrested during a routine traffic stop. Her death was suspiciously ruled a suicide. There was Freddie Gray in Baltimore on April the 19th, 2015, who was killed while in police custody. Subsequent protests, which turned destructive, the culmination of grief and rage, led to over 250 people arrested, upwards of 350 businesses damaged, 60 structural fires, 27 businesses looted. In the fall of 2015, the Black Lives Matter movement hit college campuses, beginning with the University of Missouri, with students demanding that university leaders address institutionalized racism and systemic anti-Blackness. Protests quickly swelled to other college campuses across the nation, Yale, Princeton, many others, as well as locally, Boston University and my very own University Brandeis. The phrase Black Lives Matter became part of the national lexicon. In a 5-year span between summer of 2013 and the spring of 2018, the Black Lives Matter hashtag, as one study estimated, was used nearly 30 million times on Twitter, an average of over 17,000 times per day. Protests evolved into movement building and a formal policy statement in August of 2016 that was issued under the banner of the collective titled The Movement for Black Lives. So I believe all of this kind of begs the question of what happened. What happened between 2016 and 2020? Indeed, it's tempting to look back on what we might call this first wave of the Black Lives Matter movement and ask, where did the movement go? What did it actually accomplish? So let me highlight just a few points about the significance of this first wave, this early wave of the Black Lives Matter movement. First is how the Black Lives Matter movement really shattered this myth of post-racialism. It's not a coincidence that the Black Lives Matter movement emerged in the years of our first Black president, Barack Obama. Obama's election was hailed by many as ushering in a new post-racial America. All of America's problems had somehow been resolved with the election of President Obama. When the history of the Obama years are written, I believe it will be clear that his mere presence alone brought to the surface always lingering racist attitudes and beliefs in white supremacy. It also raised the expectations of a younger generation of African Americans not as deeply invested in the symbolism of the Obama presidency, who translated their frustrations and freedom dreams into the Black Lives Matter movement to hold Obama and the country accountable for its promises. A second key point is how the Black Lives Matter movement ushered in a new generation of young leaders who challenged an old guard, who were more kind of committed to incrementalism and invested in the very system that needed to be transformed. These were high school students, college students, as well as non-conforming Black men, women, queer, trans folk, not reliant on a single model of charismatic leadership, kind of in the mold of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. This was indeed not predicated on one dominant individual, but was instead a leaderful movement, as the participants described it. In some ways, this was a double-edged sword, as kind of this approach created some problems with accountability as well as a sense of direction. But at the same time, it was incredibly empowering and created leaders of many different types, backgrounds, kind of connected to local local everyday struggles. A third key point had to do with new organizing tactics and specifically the use of social media. Certainly not a coincidence that the Black Lives Matter movement started on social media, on Facebook. This really reflected how the Black Lives Matter movement was very innovative in terms of its thinking, in terms of its strategies, in terms of its tactics, its use of modern communication. And social media specifically allowed for a type of decentralization and dexterity that has made the movement very unique. Again, we can perhaps look at this critically, but we certainly see how social media was and continues to be used as a very powerful tool to both expose the injustices of racism and violence against Black people, but also to educate and to organize. And lastly, the importance of local organizing, the importance of the Black Lives Matter movement at the local level. Oftentimes we get fixated on the national, but it's really important to really think about the impacts that the Black Lives Matter movement had at the local, the state, and even municipal levels. Certainly we can acknowledge the role that Black Lives Matter movement activists played in pressuring the Obama administration. He met with activists in the White House in 2016. But if we look at the changes that took place on the local levels between 2016 and 2020, in terms of the election of mayors, the transformation of city councils, district attorneys, judges, police chiefs, sheriffs, all of these were incredibly important developments that reflected the local, even grassroots impact of the Black Lives Matter movement pre-2020. So this is some of the recent history that shaped kind of where we are now, and I believe must shape how we think about events in the summer of 2020. Now, we all lived through that very tumultuous, very traumatic summer, many of us living through it much more intimately and viscerally than others. So I'm not going to go into a great amount of detail about what happened during those incredibly searing months. But given, as I said, the short attention span of the vast majority of Americans when it comes to race and the desire to always turn the page and move on, I think it is worth emphasizing some of the flashpoints that brought us here. There was the death, what we I think can rightly describe as the lynching of 25-year-old Ahmaud Arbery on February the 23rd, 2020, who was pursued by 3 white men and fatally shot while jogging near Brunswick in Glenn County, Georgia. There was the death of Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old emergency medical technician, fatally shot by Louisville Metro Police in her home on March the 13th in 2020. Plainclothes officers entered her apartment, executing a no-knock search warrant. Gunfire was exchanged between Taylor's boyfriend and the officers, her boyfriend believing that the officers were intruders. Louisville police officers fired over 20 shots. Taylor was shot 8 times. And then there was, of course, the murder of George Floyd on May the 25th in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Floyd was accused of using a counterfeit $20 bill at a local convenience store and was placed under arrest. During his detainment, a white police officer knelt on Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds while Floyd was handcuffed, laying face down, calling for his dead mother, repeatedly pleading for his life and saying, "I can't breathe," until he died. The brutally graphic nature of Floyd's death, captured on cell phone video, spread throughout the country and the world, sparked protests, first in Minneapolis and then across the country and internationally. In the ensuing weeks, the nation became engulfed in a national reckoning about race and racism. This entailed demands for police accountability, including the defunding of police departments, among other demands, but also expanded into many other areas of public life. Indeed, no sector of American society was untouched in the summer of 2020. So what was different this time? What was different in the summer of 2020 than in this previous wave of the Black Lives Matter movement that I articulated earlier? First, I think we need to look at the size, composition, and duration of the protests that took place last summer. They began in Minneapolis, but quickly spread across the country to over 2,000 cities and towns, and in over 60 countries. Polls in the summer of 2020 estimated that between 15 million and 26 million people have participated at some point in the demonstrations in the United States, making the protests the largest in United States history. This was truly remarkable. People of all walks of life, cutting across race, class, age, religion, every demographic that you could think of. It took place in large cities, small towns, major urban centers, to suburbs. And they also took place in Lexington, Massachusetts. And I want to acknowledge the activists and participants in the protests in Lexington that took place last year in June, and to play this video in recognition of their efforts. And anyone in the audience who may recognize yourself in that video, please feel free to perhaps share your experience in our Q&A time period, or kind of share a little bit more about the ongoing efforts in the wake of that very moving rally that was held. So the size, scale, duration of the protests, different, incredibly significant. Second, we need to think about the national political and racial climate of the time, which can be directly tied to former president, and I say that with emphasis, former President Donald Trump. Trump, early as a candidate in 2016, made the Black Lives Matter movement his enemy, describing activists as terrorists, branding himself as the law and order candidate, pledging his unwavering support to police. Appeals to white supremacists continued throughout his presidency, leading into the summer of 2020. Trump, as the protests began in late May and early June, began to position himself in explicit opposition to the Black Lives Matter movement. And this clip that I'm going to show, I think, illustrates this quite profoundly and, in my opinion, quite tragically.
Many of those who are spreading violence in our cities are supporters of an organization called the Black Lives Matter, or BLM. It's really hurting the black community. It's hurting the black community. This is an unusual name for an organization whose ideology and tactics are right now destroying many black lives, and whose first phrase was, you remember this, pigs in a blanket, fry them like bacon, referring to our police. That's referring to our police. The stated goal of BLM organization people is to achieve the destruction of the nuclear family, abolish the police, abolish prisons, abolish border security, abolish capitalism, and abolish school choice. That's what their stated goals are. Now, Biden believes that all black Americans have to think the same way. That's what it was all about. Today's Democrat Party is run by, he doesn't know black Americans like I do. And I can tell you. Over the last 50 years.
Okay, enough of that. As I said, as the protests folded, Trump very deliberately focused on the sporadic outbreaks of looting and violence, which took place, despite the fact that 93% of individual protests were peaceful and non-destructive. And as the Washington Post estimated, by the end of June, over 96% of the recorded demonstrations involved no injuries or property damage. Nevertheless, as this tweet that he sent out, echoing the words of late Miami Police Chief Walter Headley, who was a notorious white supremacist, advocate of police brutality during the civil rights movement. When the looting starts, the shooting starts, basically glorifying or legitimizing the shooting of peaceful protesters by police. The protests in the summer of 2020, I believe, can be seen as a direct response to Trump. Obviously, his very inflammatory response to the Black Lives Matter movement, his naked racism, but also to the totality of the Trump presidency, which was characterized by authoritarianism, fascist tactics, and propaganda, as well as administrative incompetency and cruelty. This again cut across race, class, and generational lines. The sense that democracy itself was on the brink of collapse, and the state had proven itself to be either complicit or incapable of effecting substantial or substantive change in the lives of the American people. And as a result, protest was seen as one of the remedies. This dovetailed with the COVID-19 pandemic. highlighting, as Monica eloquently stated earlier, the disparities that African Americans were confronting, how the COVID virus in many ways exacerbated the virus of racism and white supremacy. Certainly in times of societal stress, racial tensions increase, and the failures of the state, particularly as it related to African Americans, were laid incredibly bare. African Americans suffered and continue to suffer disproportionately from the COVID-19 virus, and the ways in which they have been seen, treated, persecuted throughout this pandemic. I believe certainly played into the responses in the summer of 2020, linking the killings of Black people at the hand of the police, white vigilantes, to the disproportionate deaths, preventable deaths of African Americans in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the failure of the state in that regard. I believe it's also important to note that the protests took place after nearly 3 months of lockdown. People surely shocked and motivated to act by the visible horror of George Floyd's death, but I believe the protests also reflected a collective desire for community and physically connecting with other people, especially those of similar political and ethical convictions. So the protests were in some ways a cathartic release during a time when people needed to express their frustrations, fears, and anger. A fourth important difference from the past, the response. Certainly we could look at the response on the national level amongst prominent politicians, most notably at the time, the Democratic candidate for president, Joe Biden, how the Democratic Party platform responded to the Black Lives Matter movement in significant ways. I believe there probably would not be a Vice President, Kamala Harris, if it was not for the Black Lives Matter movement and the pressure that was brought to bear at the national level. We also witnessed a very profound cultural reckoning as well, specifically in regard to Confederate monuments, the broader meaning and ingrained nature of white supremacy in our everyday lives, in our physical infrastructure and public space, things that before the summer of 2020, many people simply took for granted. We look to what happened in the entertainment industry and specifically in the sporting world with Black athletes recognizing their power, their voice, taking advantage of their platform to take very bold stands in support of the Black Lives Matter movement and holding their respective organizations and associations accountable. Really can only kind of compare this movement to kind of the 1968 kind of Olympic moment. Although what I think we are still continuing to see now is much more widespread. The response by businesses and corporations, from Amazon to Pokemon Company. I didn't even know there was a Pokemon Company, but apparently there is, issuing statements and donating significant sums of money to various organizations in support of the movement. Certainly a good thing, although again, I think we could also look at this critically as well. So the response was and is very, very different and significant in terms of distinguishing it from the past. And the backlash is also significant as well. The response by law enforcement and the state to the Black Lives Matter protests, the full mobilization of the government and military resources, including the Department of Homeland Security. As a matter of fact, there's an article in the New York Times that I think was just posted this evening, which reports on how how cities across the country really mishandled the Black Lives Matter protests with militarized and over-aggressive tactics. So again, we see this reckoning still taking place. We can also look at the invocation of the phrase Blue Lives Matter and the thin blue line flag, which became quite ubiquitous during this period as a direct response to the Black Lives Matter movement. Kind of begs the question, when hasn't there been a time when police and law enforcement, when their lives have not mattered more than anyone else? So there's clearly something else going on here. We see how it was used in the 2020 election, appropriated by former President Trump as a symbol of his opposition to the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as his so-called commitment to law and order, but also how the thin blue line flag had some very dubious and problematic bedfellows as well. In regards to the 2020 election specifically, again, Trump doubled down on his strategy from the 2016 election, really weaponizing white fear, using law and order as a response to the Black Lives Matter protests as a centerpiece of his campaign. And this backlash continued into the aftermath of the election with claims that the election was stolen, rigged, which were highly racialized, focusing on Georgia, on majority Black cities, or significantly Black cities like Philadelphia and Detroit, further playing into the fears that America was somehow being taken away from the people who it rightly belonged to. The December 12th, 2020 rally, organized by the Proud Boys, who Trump had infamously told to stand back and stand by, was marked by violence, 4 people stabbed, 33 arrested, as well as the burning of a Black Lives Matter sign from the Asbury United Methodist Church, one of the oldest Black churches in Washington, D.C. Again, all part of the backlash of the protests from the summer of 2020, leading up to the January 6, 2021 riot at the nation's capital, which we are all familiar with what happened. What we saw, what we continue to see in terms of the response to the Black Lives Matter movement is the use of Black Lives Matter for stoking white fear, as well as for naked political gain. Very recently, Senator Ron Johnson from Wisconsin, speaking on a local talk radio show, said that he didn't feel threatened at all by the rioters in the nation's capital. And I'm quoting from him, even though those thousands of people that were marching to the Capitol were trying to pressure people like me to vote the way they wanted me to vote, I knew those were people that loved this country, that truly respected law enforcement, would never do anything to break the law, so I was not concerned. And he went on to add, quote, had the tables been turned and President Trump won the election and those were tens of thousands of Black Lives Matter and Antifa protesters, I might have been a little concerned. So this is part of the history, right? This is part of the recent history that we are still reckoning with, that is still with us today. And of course, this begs the question of what now and where do we go from here? I don't pretend to have all the answers. Racism and racist violence certainly has not gone away in less than a year. White supremacy remains very much alive and well. Democracy in this country remains incredibly fragile. We remain a nation with a very short memory span that dangerously revels in our so-called exceptionalism that would rather move on from the past than actually reckon with it. But I will say that change must start with us. It must start with you. We certainly cannot wait. We cannot be content to just profess our solidarity. It must be a commitment and a way of life, an everyday way of life. And with commitment comes risk. We have to ask ourselves, what are we willing to risk? What are we truly willing to risk to ensure that every Black life matters? So I want to leave us with a quote from James Baldwin, who said, The obligation of anyone who thinks of himself as responsible is to examine society and try to change it and to fight it at no matter what risk. This is the only hope society has. This is the only way societies change. Thank you very much, everyone. I think I'm gonna stop sharing my screen at this point, and hopefully we can squeeze in a little time for some questions and comments.
Yeah, but thank you so much. This is Maggie Pax, also from the Cary Lecture Committee, here to kind of moderate some of the Q&A. And I just want to thank you for that very compelling and tragic review of the last 7 or 8 years, and a reminder of how much we've lost, how much Black people have suffered, and hopefully an awakening that persists. One that, you talked about the amnesia, distortion, and erasure that has been so prominent for so long, in remembering issues of Black disunity or not treating Blacks equally. And so I hope we can come to a point where that's not a continual cycle. Now, I did want to ask you, since we only have 6 minutes before the hour, if we could just keep you for a little longer, because some of the questions.
Absolutely.
So we'll go till maybe 10 past, but there's 143 people on the call, and there's some questions that are rolling in that I definitely want to get to. If everyone can put those in Q&A, it just makes it easier for us to find those. So a lot of great stuff in there. One of the questions that's come in is just, you talked about Barack Obama as the president making history as an African-American. At the same time, it didn't change, didn't put us in a post-racial period. When you think about now and Kamala Harris's presence in the White House, what do you think the effect of her in that path-breaking role could be for Black Lives Matter and for the treatment of Blacks across the country? Do you think it will be transformative, and how do you think it might be? Or do you think it's just one step in a long path?
Right. Well, I certainly don't want to discount the significance of Kamala Harris's ascendancy to the second highest position in the country. It's a remarkable achievement. The fact that a woman of color, a woman of African descent is holding that office, that matters. That's the culmination of a very long history of struggle by Black women for recognition at the highest levels of this country's government. But I think if we take any lessons from the Black Lives Matter movement, is that we cannot rely on political figures. We cannot rely simply on political symbolism for substantive change. I think the Black Lives Matter movement has been very successful in pushing the agenda of the Democratic Party, of the new Biden administration, to address issues such as policing, to be very clear about naming racism and white supremacy when it rears its head. So these are all important things, and the movement has been very effective, I think, in pushing Kamala Harris to the left, who was a former prosecutor, who was very close. And in many respects still is to law enforcement and the criminal justice system. So change is not going to happen, simply by relying on prominent figures in prominent places. It's going to have to continue to be from the bottom up, from the grassroots, holding our elected officials accountable, but also recognizing that politics and our democratic process plays out in many different ways. And some of the most effective transformations that need to take place are indeed at the local levels.
Yeah, and that's something you really emphasize, right, in what's different this time, is it's not top-down led, but there's a lot of grassroots organizing that's really driving this.
Of course, yeah.
So another person on the line is thinking about some of what you just covered in the last year, and the sort of the groundswell of activity around Black Lives Matter, and then how things quieted down in the fall, maybe because of COVID, maybe because there might have been a sense that keeping this level of protests alive would play into Trump's hands as he was trying to put out a law and order message. What's your take on maybe whether things did calm down or slow down in the fall, and why.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, again, this is why it's so tough to be a historian of the very recent past, just a few months. You know, I think all the reasons that you stated are certainly accurate. We're in the midst of a pandemic, right? And the fact that Black people were and continue to suffer disproportionately, I think was a very important factor. I think it's also important to recognize the energy that goes into protest, the amount of risk involved, especially for Black people, for those who are on the front lines, the level of repression that many protesters faced, you know, certainly by local police, but also going all the way up to the highest levels of the government, and whether we're talking about the Justice Department or the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense. So I think we need to acknowledge the incredible headwinds that protesters were facing as well. I think the political dynamic, you know, certainly played into it. I don't think it was necessarily a fear of playing into Trump's hands, but I do think it was a recognition that we were in the midst of an election season, and that political process, I think, played out in such a way in that I don't want to say that the protest and movement was co-opted, but I think it was kind of folded into the election season, and how kind of the natural progression, as many people were professing, was to take the energy from the summer of 2020 and to translate it into voting in the fall. I think that was true in many respects. I mean, we could look at what happened in Georgia and other locales. But again, I think we're still going to have to really kind of unpack, you know what certainly happened in the fall, and kind of where the movement is today.
Yeah, and that maybe it is the case. You would know from studying history better than I would, that do movements transform themselves into action that results in changes in the legislature or in you know, positions of power? And is there a cycle from protest to other forms of action that creates lasting change? Like you said, it's hard to know with so recent events. Let me ask you a question that's come up here on the Q&A. You know, you showed us some videotapes of, you know, a lot of white people in Lexington, right? With a pretty white town, not only white, but there are a lot of white people here. And these people, all of us, are allies. At the same time, I wonder how you look at that and say, you know, we're trying to educate ourselves. Yet it's possible that you could drive around and see a lot of signs and wonder if that might be a relatively safe form of action versus changing other things that are more painful and cause us to give up more. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on white allies.
Allies are important. I mean, there's no question. And, you know, I think I give great credit to anyone and everyone who participated in the protests this past summer. You know, I don't try and judge people's motives for taking that very important step to make a statement, to step into the public sphere, right? To make yourselves vulnerable in ways that perhaps you had not done before. So I think that's all very noble, right? But I do think, you know, what happens next, right? It's important that we don't view allyship as performative, that we don't view allyship as a way to kind of cleanse our conscience, and you know, once we feel satisfied in that regard, to move on with our daily lives. Allyship also, as I tried to express in the quote by James Baldwin, must come with risk, must come with sacrifice, must come with recognizing the vulnerability that one has to subject themselves to in order to be in a true allyship. What are you willing to give up? What aspects of your privilege are you willing to give up? So I think, this is an important reminder about how allyship, needs to be an everyday practice, an everyday mode of sacrifice.
Yeah. Related to allyship, or maybe to other groups, there's some questions that are coming out, maybe especially because of what's happened in the last week. And the questions are around the history of the Black Lives Matter protests, but even way back in history of African Americans fighting for justice. And then the parallel but different story of Asian Americans fighting for their own racial equality and their own ability to find a place in the American dream. And the stories are different. I mean, you are a historian, and you have studied, century or so now of Black history and American history. What parallels or what completely different things do you see in these different situations?
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly there are differences, different histories, but I think there's a lot of similarities that we need to recognize as well. Part of what we see in the long history of violence against Indigenous peoples, against Asian Americans, against Latinos, and against African Americans is this process of othering and placing racialized groups outside of the boundaries of Americanness and belonging. And using violence as a means to enforce, certain ideas and notions of otherness and unbelonging. So certainly we could look at the long history of violence against Asian Americans, certainly going back to back to the 19th century, how some of the earliest exclusion laws, barring Japanese and Chinese from citizenship, from entry into the country, reinforced by really vicious modes of violence and exploitation, kind of mirroring similar patterns that other racialized groups in this country have experienced. I think it's also important to acknowledge not just the differences, but also the various moments of solidarity between African Americans and Asian Americans. Oftentimes these differences, especially in our kind of very charged, hyper-competitive environment today, get enhanced. But there is a very important history of African American, of Black, Asian solidarity. On a global level, but also in the context of racial struggles in the United States.
Yeah. There are many questions with practical questions about what can I do. We might have to show your slide again with the link you had for some of the activities that people can do. I think there was a slide in there, but I want to ask you kind of an unfair question, right? You're a historian. You look at the history and help us understand what's happened, and you've been doing that for this talk as well. But maybe unfairly, I want to ask you to look forward and say, in maybe not 100 years' time, but in 10 years' time, can you think about or share with us how you think this Black Lives Matter movement could have a lasting effect and could, for example, one of the questions is around, could it be around the right to vote? Could this be the direction that energy gets put? And maybe to look forward a little bit and think, where could this be in 10 years' time? And what kind of changes could you think of systematic or lasting from Black Lives Matter?
Well, I'm a historian, so it's hard to predict anything. I'm still trying to figure out what has happened, not what's going to happen.
Yeah.
I think that certainly, time will tell. I think the Black Lives Matter movement has reminded us of the durability of racism the durability of white supremacy. So I think in that regard, we need to really be vigilant, to recognize that, you know, things are not going to change overnight. Things are not going to change in the next year. Things may not change significantly over the next 10 years. But to also remember that progress is slow and progress is incremental, but it is indeed possible. I think that we are really at a critical juncture in this country's democracy. A lot of that has to do with the democratic process itself, the right to vote, the access to the ballot, and ensuring that everybody has their voice heard. So I certainly see, you know, voting rights as once again being one of the critical issues of our time. But I think we also need to continue to stay focused on what remains one of the key concerns, if not the key concern of the Black Lives Matter movement, which is policing. And in some way, this is an issue that is so fraught. The history of policing in this country still has not been fully reckoned with. And certainly there's a lot of really important work, a lot of scholarship being done in this area. But just the visceral reaction, the backlash to even the thought of defunding the police, you know, is something that I think is very telling. So I hope that we will get to the point, you know, maybe it'll take 10 years to get there, I don't know, when we can really begin to critically rethink the role and function of policing in this country, and just what it says about our values as a society, as a nation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. I'm just going to go for one more question before I maybe share the slide with your book recommendations. But
Sure.
the question is from someone who says that as a Jew and with the Holocaust in the person's background, the person is struck by that. So anti-Semitism hasn't been mentioned among the racisms, and yet it's been with us for a very long time too. What parallels might you see between the Jewish othering and the other groups? And we've talked about Asians having a different parallel history, maybe. How do you think about the Jewish othering as well?
Yeah, well, certainly, I mean, the very long history of persecution against Jews globally, but also in the specific context of the United States. You know, I teach at Brandeis University, a university that was founded in response to the exclusion of Jews from higher education, that you know, holds the values you know, of the Jewish community, you know, very dear to the university's mission, and really connects with, you know, kind of my positioning in terms of Black studies, you know, in the context of the university, recognizing that, you know, there are shared struggles and shared histories that we need to be cognizant of. Certainly the kind of rise of fascist, white supremacist extremism, you know, in the past several years has directly impacted the Jewish community, you know, in similar ways that it's impacted African-American communities, Asian American communities, Latino communities. You know, in some ways, no one has been spared from, you know, the ugliness of, you know, certainly the past, you know, 4 or 5 years. So it's important, I think, that we remember kind of our histories. We remember the importance of coalition building, certainly recognizing the uniqueness of our own experiences, but also recognizing our shared struggles and our shared humanity.
I'm just going to squeeze one more question in because I want to ask you personally. So you have spent a lot of time studying W.E.B. Du Bois, and
Yes.
in some ways his evolution from being a a scientific historian to being an advocate to going through stages of idealism and disillusionment. And I wonder for you as a historian, but in the thick of a very sort of wrenching time, do you feel a parallel between his journey of moving from pure sort of academia to advocacy, or is this not the right comparison to make?
Yeah, I'm always happy to be compared to Du Bois. But yeah, I think that, part of it is, my grounding in African and African studies. Certainly I'm trained as a historian, my PhD is in history, but I really kind of root myself in the traditions of Black studies, which has always been connected to political struggle, which has always been connected to a type of advocacy, of using our knowledge, using our skills, using our scholarship to advance the struggles for Black freedom and equality. And that kind of continues to give me hope, to give me strength and motivation. Thinking about someone like W.B. Du Bois, but all the other kind of towering figures in Black studies, in the Black freedom struggle, who had it much harder than I did. So, I really, use history, as a source of motivation. Yeah, there's a lot of ugliness to it. A lot of it is difficult, but there's so much beauty in it as well, which is always inspiring.
Thank you for that. And speaking of scholarship, I am just going to share, several people on the call are asking about what they can do to educate themselves or to learn how to take the appropriate actions. And I just want to share this set of recommendations that you put out. Certainly the Charleston syllabus was put together, I think, to help with so many kind of clueless people like us, maybe asking questions on Twitter or Facebook or other things about what people could do. And that's a great resource. And then 400 Souls, kind of a chorus of voices about the last 400 years of African-American history in this country. We also put up your book, Torchbearer of Democracy, really talking about one and a lot of your research there. So these are all great resources, and you can get them at any local bookstore. We have one of them listed here, but we recommend any bookstore that you go to find these resources. And awesome. I just want to thank you tonight for coming tonight and for taking the time to speak with all of us. It's been a huge pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much. This has been a joy, and greatly admire you making the space, the opportunity to have this conversation.
It's our pleasure. I'm going to show one more slide to get a highlight who our next speaker is, which is Paul Farmer. People can see the date here is April 24th, 8 o'clock. That will be a Zoom presentation. We don't even know where Paul Farmer will be. Will he be in Rwanda? Will he be in Haiti? Will he be in Boston? We're not sure, but we do hope people will join us for that session as well. And just want to sign off. And again, thank you very much, Professor Williams, for your time.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Bye-bye.